Hi, Dr. Kelly Watson here, and today I want to talk to you about how to translate some of what you're learning about theory into practice. So, I'm going to start with a little commercial you've probably heard a number of times during the program, and that is why it's so important to get a DBA and what the world needs from DBAs. We really want to make sure that the connection between academia and the real world strengthens and becomes more flowing, meaning a two-way relationship. Because a lot of folks, as you know, who go into academia tend to do it when they're really young and maybe haven't had some of the organizational experience. And so for them, they're getting a lot of theoretical grounding and they're understanding constructs from research that's been done. And so it's valid, it's statistically strong, maybe, but they don't always translate that into practice in the best way because they haven't seen it. They haven't been there in the workforce to see it. So in many cases, it's what we call theoretical. It's like this should work in theory, and we've got some data sets and we've actually, done some exploratory empirical studies, but how does it apply and why? Some of those deeper research questions really come from, the folks who are doing it, who are there. And you as a DBA have such a unique perspective on that because of the fact that you've done it first, and now you're understanding how to actually study it or document for others what this phenomenon is and what it's doing and why. So it's really, really powerful. We want to make sure that, theory gets applied in the workplace. And I think it's especially important in business because so many people make money from making stuff up that it doesn't have the same statistical rigor. And yet it's presented as fact in the workplace. And so really, really important to have both sides of this. So you see a phenomenon, you notice that there may be some patterns. It's important to also now ground it with the proper research to prove that that's actually something that you're seeing that's important. So really important. We want this two-way street to happen. We want more people to get DBAs so that they can actually contribute going forward, and that there will be, hopefully, for managers, a lot more a lot more real evidence that stuff works so that they don't have to sort of fumble around in the dark and rely simply on their own experience to get stuff done. So I think it's, really great that you're doing this program and that you're now part of this dialogue between academia and the real world and practice. Um, Obviously, having you do this really makes some of the research that's been done in the past more relevant because you're actually able to now translate for practitioners, which is a big part of why we're doing this portion of the course, translating the research that's been done into those practical insights and doing it in a way that practitioners can understand and absorb and practice. Um, it also is important because it's actually, if we take research into practice, it can improve how managers make decisions. It can be used for thoughtful insights and empirically proven techniques for finding, for doing the work that we do out in practice. And I think that that's a really important thing. And I'm going to share how I've done that in my business in just a moment. I also think it's important to maintain credibility for academic institutions. So being able to translate what they've done into practice shows that there is value in society in doing actual research and not just allowing the loudest voice to claim that something is what it is or is real. So I do think that hopefully in this course you've learned how important real research is, not the stuff that people say when they Google stuff, but actually what builds those constructs, what creates our knowledge, how we know things, because it's actually been proven by academia. So this gives academia a lot of credibility when you can take the methods and what you've learned in this course and apply it into the real world. So I'm going to show you an example. I do a lot of engagement work for clients, engagement studies. And there's a lot of folks out there that claim that they're doing, employee engagement work, and they send around a lot of studies and surveys and, provide results back. And when we were first started to do this work, we were frustrated by some of the stuff we saw out there, because it was using survey design that was not empirically tested. It was, a lot of giving people back descriptive statistics that weren't really meaningful. It's like, okay, that's interesting. These people are engaged, these people aren't, but not really telling managers what to do with that and how to make decisions with that information. So when we were first asked to do an employee engagement survey for a client that we had a lot of credibility with already, we went to the literature. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that by sharing my screen here for a second. So we went to the literature, and similar to how you're probably taught to design studies, it starts with a construct definition. So what does the literature already say about engagement? What is it? Who are the researchers that studied it? What have they learned in the past? Starting from what already exists. So, we got some definitions about what engagement does, that there are levels to engagement, that we're talking about work engagement. So, is that different from maybe belonging and some of those different scales? What is doing engagement? What are some of the behaviors and cognitive framing that's happening? And so, we just started to, and we made a list, and actually this was part of the list we made, but we made an exhaustive list of the definitions of engagement. Then we said, okay, well, how is it measured? How is this thing called engagement measured in the literature? And, has it been cited? Has it been used a lot? And so we started to, make a list of just what scales have been used, how many items are in the scale, because, again, in academia, we may have the luxury of having really long surveys, but in the workplace, attention spans are not so long. So we wanted to see how many items. The other thing is that oftentimes in the literature, for something to be proven, you have to ask the question. You've probably learned this in your methods class, but you have to ask the question in multiple different ways to make sure that people have understanding of it and that it truly is valid. So some of these scales, like this job satisfaction scale, which measures an adjacent concept, not really engagement, but we added it to the list. But it has 35 items on it. Well, that's probably going to get pretty cumbersome if you consider that a lot of times when we measure engagement, we don't just measure engagement, we're measuring a bunch of other constructs at the same time. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So 35 is probably, even though this has had a lot of citations, it's probably not going to be something that's going to work for us. So anyway, we made a list of the different scales. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but this is the place that we started as we were trying to figure out what scales are we going to use? How are they validated? Were there problems with the validation? So we really sort of started to hone in on this Schuck scale. Because it had a decent number of citations, but also it was more recent than some of these others, and it built on the work from some of the other ones. So it built on this EES scale, which is, was which was pretty well validated, but had some problems. And the Schuck group decided to, make it a much more narrow scale. So they only had 11 items. And what also was cool about it, and, I'll jump to the questions now to show you kind of questions. So here we actually made an exhaustive list of all of the questions that were from these different scales. And, made comments about whether we liked these questions and things like that, because some of them also seem a little abstract. So when we get back to this Schuck scale that we liked, it actually, even with only 11 items, it actually had 3 different subcomponents. It had cognitive engagement, emotional engagement, and behavioral engagement. And we really liked the thought that you could measure engagement on different subtypes, and that those subtypes could tell you more about what was happening with your engagement than simply just an overall score. Because sometimes when you're doing this, or always, you have to think about, what is the end result? What am I going to get? I'm going to get a number. Is that number going to be meaningful to the organization or not? And I feel like one number saying, and yeah, they're engaged, versus 3 subtypes. I think that 3 subtypes is a much more telling phenomena. Like, it can tell you more of the components of engagement. So, and we have found this actually, that there are often times when people are emotionally engaged with the work, especially, in a nonprofit or a company that does something very mission driven and is doing a good job of engaging people in mission. But maybe they're less cognitively engaged because, and this has some of the workplace factors that can disrupt cognitive engagement, like distractions in the workplace, not having the tools to do your job and things like that. And so that can be telling, if employees are highly emotionally engaged, but maybe they're less cognitively engaged, then maybe the organization has to get out of the employee's way, and take down some of the barriers to this cognitive engagement. And then there's behavioral engagement. This is getting them to do the things that they want to do. It's actually, if you think of cognitive engagement as being sort of the I want to focus, I want to do what I want, I'm there, and I can focus. Here's the outcome. Like, what is the extra effort that I'm going to put in because of the fact that I'm so cognitively and emotionally engaged? So really, these are, we found this to be a robust scale. And so that's why we ultimately ended up choosing that as the scale that we use. We also didn't see a whole bunch of repetition because, again, that can be frustrating in practice, even though it's important in the literature. We felt that these questions were, even though maybe testing the same subconstruct, were also different enough that it wasn't distracting for people taking the survey, which, again, this is something where practice and academia need to be bridged, right? Because, and I'll give you another example. We had a client where the folks that were taking the survey were very low education level. And so some of the words in the survey were too academic, right? And so it was a great lesson for us that we ended up having to actually change the language and make it a more accessible language for folks that had a lower level of literacy. And then we had to actually go back and revalidate it and make sure statistically this still had some validity. Because if you change the survey too much, it can actually mean something else. So again, important why you've got this bridge between the academic side where you understand why that's important, why constructs need to be validated. And then, the real world where we also have to have the folks taking the survey be able to understand what it is they're answering. So, these are important challenges that I think you, again, as a DBA, are really well positioned to manage. So next I'm going to share, what the outcome, like an example outcome of this survey that we did. I mentioned to you that we asked more than just 11 questions, that we also asked questions about other constructs. So we actually embed multiple scales in our engagement survey. So yes, we measure engagement, but we also measure some other constructs. And the reason that we do that is because, again, I can give you back all of the descriptive statistics about how engaged your employees are. And I can give you these subtypes, which is somewhat helpful. But really, if you think about it in the whole research scheme, that's an outcome variable, right? That is your why. And you really need to know, if you're going to be able to make better decisions about how to impact that why, you need your X variables, right? You need your independent variables. So if you're going to go to the employees and ask them about the Y variable or the dependent variable, you also should probably be asking them about the independent variable too. Now, you've learned probably in your methods class that asking the X and the Y variable at the same time has problems of bias and some other things like that. But again, this is where the practicality of the workplace is really, really important. We're not going to be able to study. We're not going to be able to publish anything that comes out of what we're doing here for clients. We're trying to help them, help their managers make better decisions, right? So yes, it's problematic to ask independent and dependent variables in the same case. But I think because we start with the engagement, the outcome variable, and then do ask the questions about the independent variables, I think it's acceptable. I think it's one of those good enoughs. So we have a couple other scales that we ask, and I'll show you about that in a second. So let me share a little bit of kind of what happens, what our outcome is here. So just make sure I am actually, yes, it looks like I am sharing my PowerPoint. Okay, so we obviously we come out at the end with, we've used a scale, so we can actually come out with a percent engaged. Now, there's two ways to do this. One is you could take the average of engagement, and we do that as well. That's some of what's blocked out here is what the average score is. And we explain that the average score is different from percent engaged. Percent engaged is where if you take a Likert and you've got strongly disagree and then neutral, and you have agree and strongly agree, that we're only reporting the agree and the strongly agree in percent engaged. And that for engagement is kind of an industry standard. People want to know just who answered positively to the survey. What the average engagement does is it gives you a sense of what the overall variance is. So is there a big variance between the non-engaged and the engaged? And that in and of itself is a really interesting place to go. If they're very close for a client, we will just report percent engaged and move on because the variance isn't very high. And as was the case in this client. But if there's a significant amount of variance, then we probably are going to delve down deeper into what is accounting for that variance and reporting the variance in all of the different segments. But I just wanted to show you overall that, yes, there's a number, we do report a number, and this is where the number comes from. But then because, and of course, we report all the demographics and all the descriptives of this number so they can see, whether it's differences in gender, race, ethnicity, departments, that type of thing, so that we can make sure that they see, what the engagement is across the organization, because it's obviously not always the case that everybody feels the same way, which is also what's different. I think a lot of organizations don't report that back for clients, and I think that that's a miss. But again, those are all just descriptive statistics. We then, of course, go into these engagement subtypes. So we break it down into cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. And as you can see here, slightly different scores in each of the different areas. And so, that can tell you that people, in this case, maybe are not very emotionally engaged with what the mission of the organization is. So they have more of a opportunity here to improve emotional engagement. And maybe in this case, the client isn't doing something that is all that mission focused, or it just hasn't been framed that way for employees, but they're very focused. So this is an organization maybe that has taken the barriers out of the way for people to do their job. They know what they're supposed to do. They're focused on doing the right thing for their job. And then the behavioral, this is whether or not they're demonstrating engagement in their intentions and actions. So this is how committed they are to the organization and things like that. So in all cases, these are actually pretty strong scores, but we get a different range. But here is where the power of running some independent variables at the same time comes from, is we also then have asked things like, we have a scale for company support that we've gone through the same rigor to develop, a communication scale. There's lots of those out in the marketplace. We've chosen one. Belonging, perceptions of senior leadership, manager skills, an emotional exhaustion scale, which of course is reversed. So this is 47.7% say they are emotionally exhausted, which is a negative, different from all the rest of these scales, and then a personal accomplishment scale. But we report back on all of these different independent variables because these can help tell us, some of the inputs that we know from the literature, again, that these are all things that drive engagement in organizations. And again, thanks to the many, many people and researchers who've come before us who've shown us this in the literature, that all of these things impact engagement. Well, so now what we do, and here's where I think this is, again, you as DBAs being able to differentiate yourself, is then we actually run regressions, and we take these independent variables and we connect them to the outcome variable and we rank them for the organization. So in this organization, differently from how this turns out, how this list turns out in other organizations, company support ends up being the highest predictor of engagement, the highest impact variable for engagement. And communication is second, belonging, and it goes down like that. So we then report back the score, but we report them back in this rank order. Because if you look, personal accomplishment, this organization ranked very high for personal accomplishment. That scale, that driver, they're doing really great. Unfortunately, it's a low driver or low impact for them in terms of their overall engagement. So it's great that people feel personal accomplishment. We want that, we know. But in this case, that's not driving engagement the way that company support is. And company support is actually a slightly lower score and one of the lower scores of all of them, remembering, of course, that emotional exhaustion is a reversed Likert score. So company support's really important for them. And if they want to improve their engagement, they want to make sure that they are, giving it their all with company support. And so even though we saw that their cognitive engagement was really high, they want to make sure that they continue some of the things that are driving that cognitive engagement. Because if they let it slip, if they started to micromanage people or put up barriers to people being able to work, they're going to see a significant impact to their engagement score. That is going to drop. And interestingly, the organization that this data is from, actually, they've had a decrease in engagement since the last time we did this. And we think that this company support is a really important indicator of why they have actually dropped in engagement. And so obviously we're, working with them to improve the items that are on company support, which include things like, having a clear promotion path, having the tools and the knowledge to do your job effectively, things like that. Communication is really, really important. Also, it's the second highest impact variable. They have a pretty decent score on communication, although we do break communication down into subtypes. Once again, communication at the broad level, communication at the manager level, and then communication at the team level. So different levels of analysis. And so when you break that down, this actually shows up as having some variance. So anyway, I think that, again, if we're going back to translating literature into practice, this is a great example of academia informing practice in a way that provides the client with specific areas that they can focus in, specific activities, because of course, everything underneath each of these scales also has independent variables that drive them. And so now we can start to pinpoint, how should this organization prioritize their time? What should they be doing to improve, and where? Because the other thing is, for each of these scales, we actually have, the descriptive statistics of all of the, who, what, where, why, and when, and what they need to do with each of those groups. So super valuable, much more valuable than some of our clients who are literally providing, just the descriptive statistics and at a very, a number. They're giving a client a number, and what do you do with that? Well, obviously you want it better than last year, but how? What are you supposed to do with it? So I hope that this is a good example of how you can translate, what you're doing in academia and the why here into practice, and think about in your own discipline, do you have variables that you're trying to influence as a practitioner? And what does the literature, go back to the literature, define the variable, the outcome variable that you want, like we did with engagement, and then go see, well, what are the drivers of that? And how do we measure those drivers? How do we measure the outcome variable? How do we measure the drivers? And can we put together something feasible? It's got to be feasible. A 35-item scale for just one of your variables is never going to be feasible, right? So what can we feasibly do that can measure this in a way that is valuable for managers so that then they can make decisions with the information that you get, starting with what are you hoping to do, and then backing into what are the pieces that drive that. And you know what? If you don't have those, if those scales don't exist, there's your research opportunity, right? There's where you get to bring this knowledge of methods and the existing literature, and that you get to fill that gap. And that is where your value comes in, because it may be a gap that's so obvious to you that, well, we're trying to achieve this and there's nobody measuring it, which makes you puts you in a perfect position, because not only do you have the ability, you've got access to literature, you've got access to methodologists, even if you're not a master of scale development, but you do have folks around you who have developed scales and that you could partner with on this. But you also have access to data. And that is the one thing that folks in academia struggle with the most, is access to the actual case, the actual, data in the workplace. So what a fabulous opportunity for you. So I hope this has been valuable. Good luck with your translation of academia into practice. Thanks for listening.